They laughed when she married a simple mountain man, but he was the heir to a secret legacy that would change everything. The autumn wind swept across the wooden steps of Pine Ridge's only meeting hall, where a row of women stood in perfect formation, their Victorian dresses pressed and proper, their arms crossed in unified judgment. At the center of their collective disdain stood Rosie Catherine, clutching a worn leather satchel that held everything she owned in the world. At 26 years old, her sage green dress had been carefully mended so many times that the original seams were barely visible, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style that spoke of practicality rather than fashion. She was known throughout the settlement as the Charity Case, the orphan daughter of a failed prospector, raised by the church mission, educated just enough to teach their children but never quite worthy of being called one of them. Hello, dear friends. Before we begin this extraordinary story, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Today's tale will remind you that appearances can be deceiving, and that the measure of a person is never found in what they wear, but in who they choose to be. A big embrace to you all, and I hope you're moved by what you're about to hear. The women on those steps represented everything Rosie had spent her life trying to earn acceptance from. Margaret Thornton, the merchant's wife, stood at the center with her expensive silk dress imported from St. Louis, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. To her right, Elizabeth Hayes, the landowner's daughter, whispered behind a gloved hand to Catherine Donovan, the banker's wife, both of them watching Rosie with expressions that mixed pity with barely concealed amusement. For years, Rosie had endured their charity, the hand-me-down dresses passed along with sighs of reluctant generosity, the teaching position at the settlement school that paid barely enough to keep her in the tiny room behind the schoolhouse, the constant reminders that she was tolerated rather than accepted. Every Sunday at church, she felt their eyes on her patched dress. Every community gathering, she heard their whispered conversations that stopped the moment she approached. She was the orphan, the charity case, the woman who would never quite measure up to their standards of respectability. But today, something had changed. Standing beside Rosie was the reason for their judgment, and he cut a figure that defied everything the settlement considered civilized. Richard Prescott stood nearly a head taller than Rosie, his weathered face partially obscured by a thick dark beard that spoke of months in the wilderness. His fur-trimmed leather vest hung open over a buckskin shirt, and his practical leather pants were tucked into worn boots that had walked more mountain trails than city streets. Where the settlement men wore pressed suits and polished shoes, Richard wore the garb of a trapper, the kind of man who lived beyond the boundaries of what these women considered proper society. His hand rested near Rosie's back, not quite touching but protective, a gesture that said he was present without being possessive. Around his neck hung a medallion on a leather cord, old, valuable-looking, but its significance lost on the judgmental crowd before them. The silence stretched between the couple and the assembled women like a chasm. Finally, Margaret Thornton's voice cut through the tension. "Rosie Catherine," she called out, her tone dripping with false concern, "surely you haven't made your final decision? There's still time to reconsider this unfortunate arrangement." Elizabeth Hayes nodded vigorously. "Dear, you're an educated woman. You teach our children. How can you possibly consider marrying a," she paused, searching for a word that wouldn't sound too cruel, "a mountain man? Someone so far beneath your station?" Catherine Donovan let out a small, bitter laugh. "Beneath her station? Margaret, let's be honest. What station does she have? She's been living on our charity for years. Perhaps this is exactly the match she deserves." The words hit their mark. Rosie's fingers tightened on the leather satchel, and for a moment, her composure wavered. This was the voice she'd heard in her head for years, the voice that told her she was less than, unworthy, a burden to everyone who showed her the slightest kindness. But then she felt Richard shift beside her, and his voice, low and warm, spoke only to her. "Are you certain about this, Miss Catherine? There's still time to reconsider if these people's opinions matter to you." Rosie looked up at him, studying his weathered face, the quiet strength in his eyes, the dignity that needed no fancy clothes or social approval. Then she turned back to the women on the steps, women who had spent years making her feel small, who had judged her worth by her father's failures and her lack of social connections, who had never once seen past her circumstances to recognize her character. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but steady, carrying across the dusty ground between them. "The only opinion that matters, Mr. Prescott, is my own. And I say yes." The shock on their faces was visible. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Elizabeth took a step back as if Rosie had physically struck her. Catherine's expression hardened into something cruel. "You'll regret this," Catherine hissed. "When winter comes and you're freezing in some mountain shack, when you realize what you've thrown away, don't come crawling back here expecting our help." Margaret recovered enough to add, "The school board will need to find a new teacher, of course. We can't have someone of such questionable judgment instructing our children." "We gave you everything," Elizabeth said, her voice rising with indignation. "We took you in, educated you, gave you a position. And this is how you repay us? By running off with some barbaric trapper?" Rosie felt something break inside her then, not her resolve, but rather the chains of obligation and shame that had bound her for so long. These women spoke of giving her everything, but they had given her nothing but conditional acceptance and constant reminders of her inferiority. They had never seen her intelligence, never valued her teaching, never recognized that their charity came with a price tag of perpetual gratitude and subservience. "You gave me nothing I didn't earn," Rosie said, her voice stronger now. "I taught your children well. I improved their reading and arithmetic beyond what any previous teacher achieved. I maintained that schoolhouse with my own hands when you wouldn't provide funds for repairs. And not once, did any of you treat me as anything other than a burden you were too Christian to turn away." She took a breath, steadying herself for what came next. "Mr. Prescott has shown me more respect in 3 months than any of you have shown me in years. He treats me as an equal, values my thoughts and opinions, and asks nothing of me except honest partnership. So yes, I choose him. I choose a life of dignity over a life of obligation. I choose authenticity over your approval." The finality in her voice left no room for argument. Richard's hand moved to her shoulder, contact at last, warm and reassuring through the fabric of her dress. Together, they turned away from the meeting hall, away from the women whose judgment had defined Rosie's existence for so long. 2 horses waited at the edge of the settlement, packed with Rosie's few belongings and supplies for the journey ahead. As they mounted and prepared to ride toward the mountains, Rosie heard Margaret's voice one last time, carrying on the wind with cruel certainty. "Give her 6 months. She'll come back begging for forgiveness. They always do." The laughter of the other women followed them as they rode away. What Rosie Catherine didn't know as she rode away from the only home she'd ever known, as she chose a rugged mountain man over social acceptance, as she rejected the charity that had sustained her for so long, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that the simple trapper beside her carried secrets that would shake the very foundations of their settlement. Richard Prescott was no ordinary mountain man. The fur-trimmed vest and weathered hands hid a truth that would transform Rosie from the object of their mockery to the woman who would change all their lives. A truth about legacy, power, and birthright that would force everyone in Pine Ridge to reckon with their cruelty. But first, Rosie would have to survive the harsh mountain winter, learn whether the man she married was truly what he seemed, and discover what happens when character meets power, and whether love built on incomplete truth can survive complete revelation. This is their story. The story of the charity case who became a queen, and the mountain man who was always a king. 6 months before Rosie rode away from Pine Ridge, she'd been certain she would die on a frozen mountain trail. The settlement had refused her request for funds to purchase school supplies, so she'd hiked the treacherous path herself, carrying what little money she'd saved. The charity case could make do or do without, that was the unspoken rule. The blizzard struck without warning. One moment the sky was gray but passable, the next, white curtains of snow obliterated everything. Rosie lost the trail within minutes. Her thin coat provided no protection against wind that cut like knives. Her fingers went numb first, then her toes. She stumbled through drifts, disoriented, knowing each step might be her last. When she finally collapsed, there was almost relief in it. At least the cold would be quieter than the settlement's judgment. Then a figure emerged through the snow, massive, fur-covered, bearded. Rosie's terror surged. She'd heard stories of mountain men, the things they did to women caught alone. Too weak to fight as he lifted her, she heard his voice, unexpectedly gentle, "I've got you. You're safe now." She woke near a crackling fire, wrapped in heavy blankets. The cabin was rustic but clean, and impossibly, books lined the walls, leather-bound volumes of literature, philosophy, history. Richard moved efficiently around a small kitchen, preparing broth, never approaching her without announcing himself first. "You'll stay until the storm passes," he said simply. "There's a spare room." For 3 days, snow imprisoned them. Rosie explored the cabin as her strength returned, discovering surveying equipment, detailed maps, journals written in educated script. When Richard caught her examining his books, he smiled. "My father valued education, even in the wilderness." They talked by firelight, about teaching methods, about the books they'd both read, about ideas and philosophies. For the first time in her life, someone treated Rosie as an intellectual equal, not a burden tolerated out of Christian duty. When the storm broke, Richard escorted her home on horseback. The settlement erupted in scandal, days alone with a mountain man. Margaret led the interrogation. "What happened up there?" "He saved my life and behaved with perfect propriety," Rosie said firmly. Margaret's lip curled. "Men like that don't do anything without wanting something." Rosie met her gaze steadily. "Maybe some men do things because they're decent." As Richard tipped his hat and rode away, Rosie thought that would be the end of it, a chance encounter, a life saved, gratitude expressed. She had no idea that Richard Prescott had seen in her something no one else had, a mind hungry for genuine connection, a spirit crushed by constant judgment, and a strength she didn't even recognize in herself. 2 weeks later, he returned to the settlement. 2 weeks after returning Rosie to the settlement, Richard appeared again. He came with furs to trade, he said, supplies to purchase. But somehow he always found his way to the schoolhouse, where the roof leaked and the winter wind whistled through gaps in the walls. "Let me fix that for you," he offered, and spent an afternoon patching shingles while Rosie taught her lessons below. The pattern established itself like clockwork. Every 2 weeks, Richard rode into Pine Ridge. Sometimes he brought books from his father's collection, advanced texts on philosophy, political theory, literature that made Rosie's hands tremble as she turned their pages. "Thought your students might enjoy these," he'd say, though they both knew the books were far beyond elementary reading. Other times he simply appeared after lessons ended, asking about her day, her students' progress, her thoughts on education and literature. He asked her opinions as if they mattered, as if she were an authority rather than a charity case playing at teaching. "Is respectability the same as goodness, Miss Catherine?" he asked once, and the question haunted her for days. Rosie found herself anticipating his visits, saving observations and questions to share. Richard brought stories from mountain communities, perspectives on the territory's history that challenged everything the settlement taught. Where did a mountain man learn such things? Where did he acquire books on law and philosophy? Family heirlooms, he'd deflect. "My father had eclectic interests." The settlement noticed, of course. Margaret cornered Rosie after church. "That mountain man is courting you, dear. What does he want?" "Conversation. Company." "Is that so strange?" Margaret's expression hardened. "From men like him?" "Yes." The church mission director summoned Rosie to his office. "Your position depends on maintaining propriety. This association is becoming concerning." The threat hung unspoken, conform or lose everything. Again. But Rosie was tired of cages built from others' approval. Tired of measuring her worth by their standards. When Richard helped her grade students' work one evening, making insightful comments about their progress, she looked at him with new clarity. "You'd make a good teacher yourself." His smile was gentle. I think you already are one. Best I've known. No one had ever validated her professional skill before. Not tolerated it, not dismissed it, valued it. 3 months into their careful courtship, Richard invited Rosie on a walk. Just a walk, he said, to show her something beautiful. She knew, somehow, that this walk would change everything. What she didn't know was that Richard had been building toward this moment since the day he found her in the snow, and that his proposal would force her to choose between the safety of approval and the risk of authentic love. Richard led Rosie to an overlook where the entire territory spread below them, settlement, mountains, valleys stretching endlessly. I wanted you to see what I see every day, he said quietly. This land, free of boundaries people create. They sat on sun-warmed stone. Richard's expression grew serious. I need to be honest with you about something. Fear shot through Rosie. Was he leaving? Married? Dying? I'm none of those things, he said, reading her face. But I am, complicated. My family has history in this territory. History I'm not proud of. I came to the mountains to escape that history, to find out who I am without certain burdens. The vagueness should have troubled her, but his sincerity was unmistakable. Miss Catherine, Rosie, I see you more clearly than anyone else seems to. I see your intelligence, your kindness, your strength. I see someone trapped by others' judgments. He turned to face her fully. I'm not a rich man or a fancy one. I can't offer you society's approval. But I can offer partnership, respect, and freedom from their cage. Would you consider sharing a life with me in the mountains? Rosie's breath caught. She'd never imagined being proposed to, certainly not by someone who saw her as an equal rather than a charity project. Richard, this is sudden. What about my teaching? My students? What about what they'll say, he finished gently. The question hung between them. I'm not asking you to marry me to escape them, Richard continued. I'm asking because I want to build a life with you. But you need to be sure you want that too, not because you're running from something, but because you're running towards something. Rosie looked at the mountains, then back at this man who offered what she'd never had, someone who saw her fully and chose her anyway. I need to think about this. Not because I doubt you, but because this decision will affect everything. Take all the time you need, Richard said. I'll be here. The next week became a trial. Rosie told Margaret, hoping for understanding, a mistake. Word spread instantly. Parents threatened to pull children from school. The settlement elite organized an intervention at Sunday service, with Margaret, Elizabeth, and Catherine listing every reason the marriage would be wrong. Richard entered quietly during their speeches. He didn't defend himself, simply stood at the back, waiting with quiet confidence. Rosie rose before the congregation, voice shaking but clear. You speak of education, I'm educated enough to think for myself. You speak of civilization, he's shown me more than I've found here. You speak of respectability, I'm done with cages. I choose Richard Prescott, and I'll marry him tomorrow. The next day, Rosie packed her few belongings. Richard waited with horses as women gathered on the meeting hall steps, arms crossed in judgment. But Rosie and Richard rode away together, toward the mountains and whatever future awaited. As they rode, Rosie felt simultaneous terror and liberation. She'd burned every bridge, abandoned every security. What she didn't know was that the man beside her carried secrets that would soon force her to question whether her choice was based on truth or illusion. Richard's cabin was more substantial than Rosie expected, a well-built log structure with 2 rooms, books lining every wall, detailed maps tacked above a sturdy desk. In the corner sat a locked trunk, iron-banded and old, that Rosie noticed but didn't mention. The first days humbled her. She couldn't chop wood efficiently, couldn't read weather patterns, knew nothing of preserving food or managing winter supplies. Richard taught her patiently, never condescending, treating her ignorance as simple unfamiliarity rather than failure. You're teaching me, he'd say. I'm teaching you. That's partnership. Evenings reversed their roles. Rosie helped Richard with advanced mathematics and complex philosophical texts, filling gaps in his otherwise impressive education. They traded skills naturally, survival knowledge for intellectual growth, building something neither could have created alone. Rosie's body transformed. Calluses replaced soft hands. Muscles developed from splitting wood and hauling water. She became capable, competent, no longer the frail schoolteacher dependent on others' charity. Without the constant performance of social acceptability, her mind cleared too. She could think, read, and learn without managing others' perceptions. But mysteries accumulated. Well-dressed men occasionally arrived, speaking privately with Richard. They called him Mr. Prescott with unusual deference, as if addressing someone of importance. When Rosie asked about them, Richard deflected, "Old business associates of my father's. Nothing to concern yourself with." The locked trunk remained locked. Winter arrived brutally. Weeks passed without seeing another person. They depended on each other completely, no escape if the relationship failed, no help if disaster struck. When Rosie fell through ice retrieving water, Richard pulled her out and warmed her shaking body. "I can't lose you," he said, and it wasn't romantic poetry but practical commitment. Spring brought contact with mountain neighbors, families less concerned with propriety than survival. They accepted Rosie immediately as Richard's wife, and she began teaching their children informally. Occasional traders brought letters from the settlement, Margaret gloating about the closed school, students missing her teaching, the church director disappointed she'd thrown away potential. Rosie realized she didn't miss that life at all. She'd built something better here. But the mysterious visitors kept coming, and Richard grew increasingly troubled after their meetings. More private conversations. More deflections. Rosie respected his privacy but sensed a storm approaching. 6 months into their marriage, they'd built something real, a partnership based on mutual respect and growing affection. But when a surveyor arrived in the mountains with railroad company documents, everything Rosie thought she knew about her husband was about to shatter. Spring brought a stranger to the mountains, a railroad surveyor with official documents claiming right-of-way through the territory. His maps showed routes that would displace both mountain families and the settlement below. Old Spanish colonial land grants, he explained, gave the railroad legal authority no one could challenge. Mountain families gathered at Richard and Rosie's cabin, the largest space available. The surveyor spread his papers across their table, presenting legal arguments with bureaucratic confidence. The families had no documented claims. They'd be forced to relocate. Richard studied the documents carefully. Something in the paperwork made him go pale, names, dates, legal language he recognized immediately. When he looked up, his expression had hardened. "These documents aren't complete," he said quietly. "There are prior claims you haven't accounted for." The surveyor's dismissiveness was automatic. "And what would you know about territorial law?" Richard's voice turned cold. "More than you'd imagine. Don't proceed with your plans until you hear from me." "And who exactly are you to give orders?" "Someone with legal standing to challenge every claim you've presented." "Leave now. You'll hear from me within the week." The surveyor left, both intimidated and puzzled. The mountain families pressed Richard with questions. How did he have legal standing? But he only asked for their trust. After they departed, Rosie demanded answers. "Richard, what's happening? How do you know territorial law? Who are you, really?" He sat heavily. "My family has complicated history with this land. History involving old grants and legal claims. I need a few days to sort through documents. Then I'll explain everything. You're keeping something from me. I'm protecting you from something. That's not your choice to make." Richard's voice cut through the awkward silence. "Leave. Now. I'll give you my decision in 3 days." When Margaret tried to interject, he turned cold. 3 days. Not before. The delegation departed reluctantly, leaving Richard and Rosie alone. The silence between them was heavy. Rosie wouldn't look at him. "Rosie, please let me explain." Her fury erupted. "Explain what? That you lied? That everything between us was built on deception? I married a man who doesn't exist." The Richard the First knew was honest, simple, real. Turns out he was a wealthy heir playing at poverty. "I am that man. The legacy doesn't change who I am. It changes that you lied about it. You let me believe you were something you're not. How can I trust anything between us?" Richard sat heavily, defeated, and told her everything. His grandfather had built an empire through corruption, exploiting workers, manipulating laws, destroying competitors. Richard's father, sickened by what his own father had become, tried to reform from inside and failed. Finally, he'd retreated to the mountains with young Richard, teaching him that character mattered more than wealth. "Every woman who knew my name wanted the Prescott legacy," Richard said quietly. "The wealth, the power, the status. No one saw me, just what I represented. I needed to know someone could love me without the name, could see my actual worth. So I was a test." Rosie's voice was bitter. "A way to prove you're better than your grandfather? Marry the charity case to feel noble? No. You were the only real thing in my life. The only person who never wanted anything from me, because you didn't know there was anything to want. But you built our marriage on a lie," Rosie said. "You say you wanted honesty, but you were hiding the truth. How is that different from everyone who lied to me, who pretended to care but only wanted something?" Richard opened the locked trunk fully, family documents, his mother's journals, his father's teachings about ethical power. "I kept it locked because I was ashamed. Ashamed of what my name represented. You're right, I should have told you before we married. I was a coward, afraid you'd see the name instead of the man." Rosie stood. "I need to be alone. To think. I'm going back to the settlement for a few days. Will you come back?" She met his eyes honestly. "I don't know." Richard didn't stop her as she took her horse and a few belongings. Mountain families watched, concerned, as she rode away. "She has every right to leave," Richard told them. "I lied to her. This is the consequence." As Rosie rode toward the settlement that had mocked her, impossible questions churned through her mind. Could she trust a man who'd hidden so much? Could their marriage survive such dishonesty? And if she left him, what was she returning to? The same judgment, the same cage. The next 3 days would determine not just her future, but the fate of everyone in the territory. Rosie returned to the settlement and found the schoolhouse occupied by a new teacher. She slept in the barn behind the building, even here, still an outsider. Margaret found her immediately, suddenly warm and concerned. "We were too harsh on you, dear. We didn't understand." The transparent self-interest disgusted Rosie. They didn't see her, only what she represented, the influence she might have with Richard. Alone in the barn that night, Rosie examined herself honestly. Why was she really angry? The lie itself, or that Richard hadn't trusted her with the truth? Would she have married him if she'd known from the start? Honest answer, probably yes. So what had changed? Only her knowledge. The real question emerged, was she angry at what Richard did, or at how it made her feel, like a charity case again, like he'd married down, like she was still the lesser one? Then the realization struck. Richard hiding his wealth hadn't made her less. It had made them equal. He wasn't rescuing her from poverty, they were building a partnership. His deception was about his shame, not hers. People sought her out constantly, wanting her to intercede with Richard. "You could save the whole community," they said. "Why would I?" Rosie replied. "You destroyed me when you thought I was nothing. Now you want help because I married well." Elizabeth approached differently. "I know you have no reason to help us. We were cruel. I'm not asking forgiveness. But I want to ask, what will you choose to be? The person we made you, or the person you became despite us? You could use Richard's power for revenge, we deserve it. Or you could be better than we were. Either way, you have to decide who you are now. Meanwhile, Richard worked through legal documents at the cabin, preparing his response to the railroad. Mountain families worried he'd abandon them without Rosie, but he assured them, I'll do what's right regardless. This isn't about my marriage. It's about all of you. On the third day, the territorial hearing convened. Everyone gathered at the meeting hall, settlement leaders, mountain families, railroad representatives, the judge presiding. Richard stood at the front with his documents. Rosie dressed in her old teaching clothes and walked to the hall. When she entered, every eye turned. Settlement leaders hoped she'd influence Richard toward mercy. Mountain families worried she'd abandoned them. Railroad representatives calculated what her presence meant. And Richard, seeing her face, knowing nothing was resolved between them, hoped desperately that her presence meant she hadn't given up. The next hour would determine everyone's fate. But more importantly, it would reveal what kind of people Rosie and Richard would choose to become with power. The judge called the hearing to order. The railroad presented first, legal documents, land grants, survey maps showing their right-of-way under Spanish colonial claims. Neither the settlement nor mountain families had prior rights. The law seemed clear. The settlement's response was weak. Their deeds all post-dated the railroad's grants. They could only appeal to mercy, citing economic hardship, but the law wasn't on their side. The mountain families had no documentation at all, they'd lived on the land informally for generations. They could only watch as their fate was decided. Then Richard approached the judge with a thick portfolio. Original Prescott land grants, predating the Spanish colonial claims, granted by earlier territorial authority. Never voided, never superseded. Still legally valid. The revelation hit like thunder. Richard's grants covered the exact territory the railroad claimed. His family had superior legal standing. The railroad's case collapsed, but so did the settlements. During recess, the railroad's lawyer approached Richard with an offer, massive monetary compensation if he'd void everyone else's claims and let the railroad proceed. He could walk away wealthier than ever. Margaret stood when the hearing resumed, offering a public apology for how they treated Richard and Rosie. We were wrong. We know we don't deserve your help. Her pride visibly crumbled. The mountain elder spoke next. Richard, whatever you decide, we trust you. You've lived among us honestly. You've earned the right to whatever choice you make. No pressure, only faith. Richard looked torn. He could take revenge on the settlement, accept the wealth, or find another way. His eyes found Rosie standing in the back. She stepped forward without invitation. I have something to say. To the settlement, you judged me my entire life. Called me charity case, burden, worthless. When I chose Richard, you mocked me. You were wrong on every count. To Richard, you lied to me about who you were. That was wrong too. You wanted someone to love you for yourself, but you didn't trust me enough to tell the truth. To everyone, but here's what I've learned in these mountains. Worth isn't about money, status, or approval. It's about what you do when you have power. How you treat people who can't help you. Whether you use strength to build or destroy. Her challenge rang clear. Settlement, you have no legal rights here, but moral ones exist. Families live here, children were born here. Richard, you have all the legal rights, but what kind of man will you be with them? Both sides, choose who you'll become. Richard addressed the judge formally. He exercised his legal standing to block the railroad's current plan, but proposed an alternative route. The railroad could build, but on an adjusted path. They'd pay fair compensation to any displaced families, employ local workers at fair wages. Richard would create a trust fund from his compensation for schools. But there were conditions. For the settlement to benefit, they had to accept changes. Rosie would direct an education program, mountain and settlement children would attend school together, economic cooperation would replace separation, social hierarchy based on origin would end. The settlement leaders conferred and accepted, the terms were too generous to refuse. The mountain families were protected, compensated, empowered. Richard had fulfilled their trust. After the hearing, Rosie and Richard walked outside together. "I'm sorry I didn't trust you with the truth," Richard said quietly. "I'm sorry I ran instead of working through it. Marriage means trusting even when it's hard for both of us. No more secrets. Everything shared. No more running. Problems faced together." 6 months later, a large school stood between settlement and mountains, where Rosie directed a teacher training program. The railroad was built, communities were intact, old hierarchies were breaking down. Margaret volunteered at the school, genuinely trying to change. Elizabeth worked on women's property rights. Richard advised the territorial government on fair labor laws, using the Prescott name for reform instead of exploitation. One evening, Rosie and Richard sat on their cabin porch, watching the sunset as students' laughter echoed from the valley. "Do you regret choosing me that day?" Richard asked. "I regret nothing except the time I wasted on their approval. You offered me partnership. I gave you purpose for your legacy. Together, we're more than either could be alone." Outside the meeting hall, women gathered as they once had, but now the group was mixed, mountain and settlement together. Margaret, Elizabeth, and Catherine stood with different postures, collaborative, not judgmental. Rosie walked among them as an equal, planning the next community project. The visual transformation was complete, from judgment to partnership, from division to unity, from cruelty to grace.